Listen closely for a moment, because what I'm about to say might explain the kind of silence that keeps you staring at the ceiling at night, the kind of distance that somehow feels louder than actual words, and the kind of behavior that leaves your heart searching for answers long after everyone else around you has stopped asking questions. There are moments in life when a person doesn't tell you the truth with their mouth, but with their actions instead. There are moments when the heart speaks in a language so quiet and so subtle that only the soul really knows how to hear it. And there are times when someone is desperately trying to tell you something, not through some perfectly worded sentence, not through a clean, tidy confession, but through confusion, hesitation, resistance, repeated returns, sudden distance, unexpected warmth, silence, longing, and contradiction. That's exactly where the deeper truth actually lives. That's the place Carl Jung would have told you to pay attention to, not just the words someone says, but the pattern hiding underneath them. Because people don't always reveal who they really are out in the open daylight. Sometimes they reveal themselves in the shadows instead. Sometimes they reveal themselves in the pauses between sentences. Sometimes they reveal themselves in what they simply cannot say, in what they carefully avoid, in what they keep repeating, and in what they just cannot seem to let go of. And if you've been waiting for some kind of sign, if you've been quietly wondering whether they still think about you at all, if you've been asking yourself why they pull away and then come right back, why they act completely detached one minute and suddenly emotional the next, why they disappear and then reappear again like some unfinished thought that won't leave them alone, then listen carefully now. The answer might already be standing right in front of you. It might not be sitting in some message they sent you. It might not be in an apology they never actually gave. It might be hidden inside the contradiction itself. Your person is desperately trying to tell you something. They are not nearly as calm as they appear to be on the surface. They are not as detached as they're pretending to be for the world to see. They are not as unaffected as they want everyone, maybe even themselves, to believe. Something inside them is active, alive, restless, and completely unresolved. Something in them has clearly been touched. Something in them has been disturbed in a real way. Something in them has quietly woken up. And when a person can't face a truth like that directly, the truth doesn't just disappear. It starts leaking out through their actual behavior instead. It leaks out through hesitation. It leaks out through thoughts that keep returning uninvited. It leaks out through dreams they can't quite explain. It leaks out through the sudden need to check on you, to hear news about you, to circle back toward you, to keep some careful distance from you, and yet somehow never truly let you go. One of the deepest lessons in all of psychology is simply this. The conscious mind is often the smoothest liar we have, but the unconscious mind is brutally, almost embarrassingly honest. A person might say, "I don't care," while their whole body is quietly saying otherwise. A person might insist, "I'm completely over it," while their mind keeps circling back to you in the silence, every single night without fail. A person might claim, "I don't miss you at all," while their emotions betray them in the smallest, most human little ways imaginable. They might not be ready yet to admit any of this truth to you directly, but that doesn't mean the truth isn't there underneath it all. It just means the truth is currently being resisted, and resistance, more often than not, is actually the very first proof that something genuinely matters to them. Because think about it honestly. Why would anyone bother resisting something that meant absolutely nothing to them? Why would someone fight so hard against a feeling that was never even real in the first place? Why would a person who truly didn't care need to constantly prove their own indifference, explain away their absence, or defend their sudden distance from you? The answer is actually fairly simple once you see it clearly. People protect themselves most fiercely from exactly the emotions that threaten to take away their sense of control. When something reaches into the hidden places inside them, when something wakes up a fear they never fully healed from, when something reminds them of what they secretly want and what they're terrified of losing, they do what so many people instinctively do in that situation. They retreat. They harden. They confuse the people around them. They test the connection without meaning to. They go quiet, almost as if silence alone could hand them power over a feeling they simply cannot master. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't actually erase the emotion underneath it. It only hides that emotion away for a little while. And that's exactly why your person may be trying to tell you this without ever actually saying it out loud in plain words. You matter more than I'm currently ready to admit. That's a genuinely heavy truth for a proud heart to carry. That's a frightening truth for a heart that's already been wounded before. That's the kind of truth that can make a person behave in the most contradictory, confusing ways imaginable. One part of them reaches out toward you, another part of them runs in the complete opposite direction. One part of them remembers the comfort, the connection, the warmth, the safety you gave them. Another part of them remembers the risk, the vulnerability, the terrifying possibility of being seen a little too clearly for comfort. And when those two parts inevitably collide inside someone, that person becomes genuinely divided within themselves. They stop being one clear voice and become two competing ones instead. One voice quietly says, "Go back to them." The other one says, "Don't expose your heart like that again." One voice says, "Tell them the honest truth." The other one says, "Stay silent, stay safe, stay hidden where nothing can hurt you." That kind of inner war is genuinely exhausting to carry around every single day. And when someone is living inside that war, their outward behavior will almost always end up confusing the very people who love them the most. But confusion isn't always a sign that something is missing or lacking. Sometimes confusion is actually a sign of being completely overwhelmed on the inside. Sometimes the person who confuses you the most is the exact same person who feels the absolute most and simply knows the least about how to handle any of it gracefully. Really think about that for a second, because when a person has no real language for their own emotions, they often end up expressing those emotions through pure inconsistency instead. They come close, then suddenly disappear. They look genuinely interested, then act completely unavailable out of nowhere. They initiate contact with you, then retreat the second the connection starts to feel emotionally real. They ask you questions, then quietly avoid hearing your actual answers. They say just enough to keep the bond technically alive, but never quite enough to make themselves truly vulnerable in front of you. This isn't always cruelty on their part. Sometimes it's simply fear wearing a convincing mask. Sometimes it's old pain wearing a performance for the world to see. Sometimes it's a heart that hasn't yet learned how to stand out in the open without trembling uncontrollably. Carl Jung understood something important here. Whatever we refuse to confront within ourselves doesn't just quietly vanish into nothing. It grows in the dark instead. It waits patiently inside the unconscious. It shapes our behavior without our permission. It controls the choices we end up making. It repeats the exact same emotional story over and over again until we're eventually forced to face it head-on. That's precisely why some people keep returning again and again to the same person, the same pattern, the same unfinished feeling, the same particular emotional gravity. They aren't simply returning to a person in the literal sense. They're returning to an old psychological wound instead. They're returning to the exact place where the truth is still quietly waiting for them. Your person may honestly be trying to tell you this: I feel something I genuinely don't know how to carry. That's really the hidden confession underneath everything else. Not, "I have nothing to say to you." Not, "I feel absolutely nothing," but actually, "I feel far too much, and it deeply unsettles me." That's exactly why the strongest emotions are so often disguised as the coldest, most distant behavior imaginable. What looks like plain distance may actually be a form of self-protection. What looks like stubborn pride may actually be nothing more than fear underneath. What looks like total indifference may actually be an attachment that feels far too dangerous for them to openly admit. What looks like empty silence may actually be a mind completely full of your name, and a heart absolutely full of unspoken internal conflict. And if you've ever loved someone who was emotionally complicated in this exact way, you already know this truth deep down. You already know that some people aren't difficult because they simply don't care about you. They're difficult because they care in a way they don't fully understand themselves. They care in a way that genuinely frightens them. They care in a way that leaves them feeling completely exposed. They care in a way that forces them to face the exact parts of themselves they'd honestly rather keep hidden forever. And when love turns into a mirror like that, not everyone is brave enough to keep looking into it for very long. That's really the great Jungian lesson about projection at work here. People often assume they're reacting purely to you as a person, but sometimes they're actually reacting to the very parts of themselves that you unknowingly woke up inside them. You may have unknowingly become a mirror for their own unmet longing. You may have stirred up a memory of intimacy they never fully processed or healed from. You may have awakened a desire inside them that they simply couldn't control. You may have accidentally reflected back their own shadow, that hidden internal place where their fear, their need, their shame, their desire, and their tenderness all quietly live together in conflict with each other. And once that mirror shows up in someone's life, many people end up doing exactly what wounded people tend to do. They step back from their own reflection instead of facing it. But stepping back like that doesn't mean the mirror has somehow lost its power over them. It just means the reflection was simply too real for them to keep ignoring. So when your person pulls away from you, don't automatically assume they've forgotten all about you. When they go quiet on you, don't automatically assume nothing at all is happening on the inside. When they act distant toward you, don't assume their heart has genuinely gone silent too. Very often the exact opposite turns out to be true. The more emotionally significant a connection actually is, the more genuinely terrifying it becomes for someone who hasn't yet built the inner strength needed to face it head-on. Some people leave a relationship because they're truly indifferent, but plenty of others leave because they're simply overwhelmed by what they're feeling. Some people leave because they're genuinely finished with it all, but others leave because they themselves still feel unfinished on the inside. And unfinished people naturally create unfinished connections around them. They send mixed signals because they're mixed up inside themselves. They offer both presence and absence within the very same breath. They make you feel chosen one moment, then completely abandoned the next. They make you feel deeply seen, then somehow forgotten shortly after. They make you quietly question your own worth, when in reality they're actually questioning their own ability to love someone without losing all sense of control over themselves. And here's the part that honestly hurts the most. They may not fully realize how deeply they've affected you, but they absolutely know that something inside them has been affected too. That's really what they're desperately trying to tell you, not through polished, careful language, not through some neat and tidy explanation, but through behavior that keeps repeating itself until you finally start seeing the emotional truth sitting quietly underneath it all. They want closeness with you, but closeness genuinely scares them. They want certainty about where things stand, but certainty requires real honesty from them. They want connection with you, but connection requires a kind of surrender they're not ready for. They want to feel truly understood, but being understood requires them to reveal exactly what they've kept hidden even from themselves for years. So they stay stuck somewhere between desire and defense, between real feeling and real fear, between what they genuinely want and what they honestly believe they can survive emotionally. And somewhere in that uncomfortable space, you become the question they simply cannot answer. You become the memory they cannot fully erase. You become the feeling they cannot completely control, no matter how hard they try. That's exactly why your absence might affect them far more powerfully than your actual presence ever did. Not because you somehow matter less when you're physically near them, but because distance forces them to feel things they can no longer manage or avoid through ordinary daily routine. When you're away from them, their unconscious finally has room to speak up. Their mind loses its usual distractions. Their heart begins its own quiet internal argument. The image of you comes back to them in scattered fragments, a passing moment, a particular sentence, a certain look, a feeling, a regret, a lingering possibility, a real sense of loss. And suddenly, the person who seemed so sure of themselves starts remembering that they're not nearly as immune to you as they'd been pretending to be all along. This is simply how the unconscious mind tends to operate. It doesn't announce itself loudly with some dramatic trumpet blast. It returns instead as a quiet whisper. It returns as a thought that keeps recurring at inconvenient moments. It returns as a dream, a stray memory, a longing that shows up at exactly the wrong hour of the night, a heaviness sitting in the chest, a sudden urge to check on you, to reach out, to know how you're doing, to reconnect somehow, to revisit what once was between you. The psyche keeps its own private calendar, and it simply doesn't obey pride. It doesn't answer to ego. It doesn't obey the false certainty behind saying, "I'm fine," over and over again. The psyche really only asks one honest question: what still remains unresolved here? And in a great many relationships, what remains genuinely unresolved isn't a lack of love at all. It's the fear of exactly what real love demands from a person. Because real love asks for genuine truth. Real love asks for actual maturity. Real love asks for real accountability. Real love asks for true presence. Real love asks for the courage to be fully seen without any mask hiding behind it. And for certain people, that particular kind of exposure feels far more frightening than simply losing the connection altogether. They would honestly rather manage their pain quietly from a safe distance than face the raw vulnerability that real intimacy demands of them. They would rather leave the whole bond sitting in some ambiguous, undefined state than risk exposing the tender, fragile, unhealed part of themselves to another person. So they hover nearby. They orbit around the connection without fully committing to it. They come back, then withdraw again. They reach out, then retreat right afterward. And through all of it, they're quietly trying to tell you something they simply don't yet have the strength to put into actual words. I'm not fully in control of what I'm feeling right now, and honestly, that terrifies me more than I can say. This is really where a lot of people end up misunderstanding love entirely. They assume love always has to be loud. They assume love always has to be direct and clear. They assume love always says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. But sometimes love is really just a wounded, frightened, unfinished kind of energy struggling to survive inside a person who hasn't yet learned how to hold it properly without dropping it. Sometimes love sounds exactly like hesitation. Sometimes love sounds exactly like avoidance. Some people feel deep love but fear vulnerability. Their inner conflict causes distance, yet your healing comes from honoring your own worth instead of chasing their uncertainty. Their inability to speak clearly isn't proof that you were never significant to them. Their silence isn't the final say on your true value as a person. Their mixed, contradictory behavior isn't some accurate measurement of how lovable you actually are. Their confusion was never your failure to carry. That's genuinely one of the most freeing truths in all human relationships. Not everyone who loves you will actually know how to love you well. Not everyone who feels something real will know how to handle those feelings responsibly. Not everyone who eventually returns is truly ready to stay. Not everyone who misses you has the courage to actually tell you so out loud. Not everyone who thinks about you has the discipline to show up for you with real integrity. And not everyone who feels torn apart on the inside can give you real peace out on the outside. So you have to learn how to listen beneath the surface of things. Listen for the underlying pattern. Listen for what keeps repeating itself over time. Listen closely to what happens once all the words have run out completely. Listen to the emotional residue people leave behind them. Listen to the way your own body reacts whenever you think about them. Listen for the deeper message quietly living beneath all the surface noise, because sometimes the soul simply knows the truth before the conscious mind ever catches up to it. Sometimes your own inner peace recognizes their instability long before your hope is genuinely ready to let it go. Sometimes your intuition hears exactly what their mouth never quite manages to say out loud. And sometimes the most loving thing you can possibly do isn't to force some kind of confession out of them, but simply to acknowledge the truth that's already quietly speaking to you in fragments. Your person is desperately trying to tell you this. They were changed by this. They were stirred by it. They were genuinely shaken. They were confronted with something. They were exposed in a way they didn't expect. They were awakened to something in themselves they may have spent years actively avoiding. And because of all that, your presence now lives somewhere much deeper than an ordinary memory ever could. It's no longer simply about affection anymore. It's no longer simply about attraction. It's no longer simply about missing someone in the usual sense. It's about the encounter with their own self that happened through the encounter with you specifically. That's really why certain people never leave our lives in the simple, clean way we might expect them to. They remain, not just somewhere in the heart, but woven into the actual architecture of the psyche itself. They become a reference point, a wound, a lesson, a mirror. And a mirror can be loved, feared, rejected outright, and still remain exactly what it is, a mirror. Once a person has clearly seen themselves reflected through someone else, they can never fully go back to complete innocence about what they truly feel. So, if they're trying to tell you anything at all through everything we've just talked through, let it be this final truth. What's genuinely real doesn't simply vanish just because it was difficult to put into words. What's truly meaningful will keep pressing against the surface until it's either faced directly or transformed into something else. What's hidden will keep quietly seeking its own expression. And what remains unresolved will keep asking again and again for real attention. This is exactly why silence is never actually neutral. This is exactly why distance doesn't always simply mean distance. This is exactly why a person's actual behavior can end up saying far more than their spoken words ever could. Because the heart is always communicating something, whether we notice it or not. The only real question is whether anyone is brave enough to actually listen closely. And perhaps your person is trying, in their own flawed, frightened, deeply human way, to communicate that they're not finished with the feeling yet, that they're not finished with what it all means, that they're not finished with the internal battle still going on inside them, that they're not finished with the memory of you the impact you left, the emotional weight of everything you woke up inside them. But even if they never managed to say any of it in plain, clear language, you now understand the deeper pattern underneath it all. You now understand that not all love arrives wrapped in certainty, not all truth arrives dressed as confession, not all longing arrives disguised as action. Sometimes the real message arrives in the form of confusion, sometimes in the form of retreat, sometimes in the form of a sudden return, sometimes in the form of a silence that somehow keeps on speaking anyway. And once you truly understand that, you'll stop waiting blindly for the right words to rescue you from what someone's actual behavior has already revealed to you all along. You stand in your own awareness instead. You see everything clearly now. You let the truth simply be enough on its own, because the truth was already there the whole time. The truth lives in the pattern. The truth lives in the hesitation. The truth lives in the pull that neither of you can fully deny, no matter how hard you both try. The truth lives in the emotional echo that lingers quietly long after any conversation ends. The truth lives in the way they keep returning to your thoughts, just as often as you keep returning to theirs. And the truth, at the end of everything, is simply this: your person is desperately trying to tell you that what they feel is real, that what they fear is real, and that what they cannot bring themselves to say out loud might just be the most important part of this whole story. So don't ignore the silence sitting between you. Don't dismiss the contradiction as meaningless. Don't overlook the unconscious language your heart already understands, because sometimes, when someone cannot say "I need you," they say it instead through every unresolved return to you. Sometimes, when someone cannot say "you matter to me," they say it through every hesitant moment they can't quite explain. Sometimes, when someone cannot say "I'm afraid of what this means," they say it by disappearing at the exact moment the bond starts feeling genuinely real. And sometimes, when someone cannot say "I'm not over you," they spend months quietly proving it in the only language they actually know how to speak. The soul always leaves its own clues behind. The heart always leaves its own traces. The unconscious always finds some way to make itself known eventually. And your job here was never to force the truth out of anyone. Your job is simply to recognize the truth whenever it arrives, dressed up as silence, distance, longing, and contradiction. That's the real message underneath everything. That's the real pattern worth noticing. That's what they've been desperately trying to tell you all along. And once you finally hear it clearly, you'll never listen to emotional silence quite the same way again.